Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey has been called a masterpiece by fans and critics alike. It is one of the greatest filmmaking achievements in his long and illustrious career, maybe even one of the most ambitious historical epic fantasies ever made. At least according to them. For me, however, that ambition fails to elevate the myth and only succeeds in undermining its timeless grandeur. Don't get me wrong and put down your pitchforks. I'm not saying that it's a bad film. In fact, it's a good film, bordering on great, but it's nowhere near the masterpiece the fanboys and the critics are claiming it to be. It is definitely overhyped and without a doubt overrated. If you just want to turn your brain off and have a good time at the theater, sure, you will have it. But is it really good enough for a filmmaker of his caliber and a film that is coming out with such astronomical levels of hype? See, if you ask me, Homer's Odyssey is a quintessential work of art that explores many themes, but at its core, it's a story about the hubris that drives our hero Odysseus to defy the gods and the devastating consequences that follow. Meanwhile, Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey aspires to be a quintessential work of art that explores many themes, but its central conflict may be the filmmaker's own hubris, a relentless commitment to defying the conventional approaches to epic filmmaking through an uncompromising pursuit of grounded realism and the consequences that follow. So, is Nolan's misplaced obsession with realism sabotaging his own film, or am I just a silly contrarian voice in a sea of glowing reviews? Let's get into it. This is the Indian Movie Critic, your unapologetically sharp voice in a world full of soft takes. Subscribe to see more and let's begin. Full disclosure, I am one of the Nolan fanboys that I was whining about a minute earlier. I truly believe that he is one of the greatest living directors of the 21st century, or at least I strongly believe he was until I watched Odyssey. We'll get into that. But first, plot synopsis. The Odyssey is an epic tale of Odysseus, a Greek warrior whose decade-long struggle to return home after the Trojan War is prolonged as a result of his pride, which consequently leads to the wrath of gods and encounters with strange mythical forces. Meanwhile, at the same time, his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus fight to preserve his kingdom from invading suitors. Yeah, this might be the story of Odysseus, but a lot of the drama in the film is actually centered around Penelope and Telemachus, and there's something about how their relationship gets portrayed in a way that deviates from the source material that says a lot about this film. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Just hold on to that thought for a while and we'll be getting to that soon enough. To paraphrase Gabe Newell, Lord Gaben, the creator of Valve, Steam and the mind behind Half-Life, Portal and Team Fortress, among many other video games, realism is neither fun nor entertaining. And while that statement was and is still applicable to video game development, I think it also holds absolutely true to filmmaking. The joy of experiencing cinema has nothing to do with realism, and is especially true for films dealing with stories of epic proportions and ambitious aspirations. So when it was announced that Nolan would be tackling Odyssey, cinephiles around the globe were worried, to say the least. Here is a filmmaker who applies his trademark grounded realism style to everything he touches, trying to tackle a story that is as removed from reality as it can be. And now that the film is out and I have watched it, I think, yeah, we were all right to worry. You know what? Let's start with the positives. The set-piece sequences in the film are glorious to behold, the Cyclops sequence especially. Same goes for the horror sequences, of which there are at least 2 in the film. The movie also features some excellent sound design, with audio intentionally clipping even or even maxing out at key moments. Bold move, but it works. Good visuals, at least for most of the film. We will get into that soon. And Ludwig Göransson does some really original stuff with the music as well. Great job from some of the supporting actors as well, and while I'm not very happy with the themes of the film, considering how different it is from the original, they are executed really well, and it did make me think for a long time, even after the credits were over, after I left the theater. Look, I'm not gonna dwell on the positives much longer because we were all served a copious amount of Odyssey glazing from our film and film adjacent critics and content creators. Maybe a little too much if you ask me. Am I saying they are paid shills, grifters and fanboys? Maybe. Because if you ask me, Nolan's interpretation of the Odyssey is among the most lifeless and sterile spectacles I have ever witnessed. A drab, soulless and underwhelming experience which is not the result of failure of execution through incompetence, but a direct consequence of deliberate filmmaking choices fueled by Nolan's misguided, single-minded stance on applying his grounded realism approach to every aspect of Odyssey's filmmaking. Sure, in isolation, some of these choices don't exactly derail the experience, but when stacked together, the final film on screen becomes exactly what I feared when it was announced. An epic fantasy that, thanks to Nolan, lacks the epic or the fantasy. You know what? Let's start with the source material. The source material in this case is not the actual Odyssey by Homer, but a 2017 modern-day literal English translation by Emily Wilson, a very left-leaning feminist writer, and oh boy is her contribution more than evident. As you are painfully aware by now, the film features everyday spoken English for the dialogues, and the result is, well, underwhelming at best and immersion-breaking at worst. It is underwhelming in the sense that it's not just everyday English, but everyday English dialogues written to be as diabolically pedestrian as possible to achieve its objective of grounded realism, as if the dialogues were something you will hear every day in the year 2026. Sure, I do understand the intention, but all this contributes to is to dialogues that have no weight, no personality, energy, juice, or sauce, as the kids say these days. This is a larger-than-life fantasy that demands larger-than-life dialogues, and unfortunately, Odyssey fails to deliver completely on that front. And it's not like it's impossible to have witty or clever dialogue with modern-day writing, by the way. That's primarily the reason people watch Tarantino and especially Guy Ritchie films, and even the Marvel films for that matter. I mean, people are annoyed these days by the said relentless quips, but no one will argue that they lack energy or that they are boring. Speaking of which, that's the next thing. The dialogue is not just boring, it's joyless and devoid of any humor. There is literally one scene in the film involving Robert Pattinson's character where something approximating humor is delivered, and this was so jarring and out of place, no one in the theater gave a damn. Am I asking for this to be a film with one-liners and jokes? Not really. All I'm asking for is something interesting with the writing, but I do have to admit a scene where the movie could end maybe with Odysseus and Penelope looking out at the sea, and maybe Penelope says, "That's quite an odd sea," and Odysseus says, "Say that again," and Linkin Park's What I've Done would start playing in the background. That would be great. You know what? Weird tangent. All jokes aside, Odyssey sounds a lot like your co-workers are speaking to each other while HR is in the room with us. The lines are toothless and weightless, and this is by design. And I think even Nolan became painfully aware of this fact at some point, because out of nowhere there will be scarce moment in the film where characters will speak out of prose out of nowhere, and this instead breaks whatever sense of immersion was actually being built up with the modern day writing. And speaking of immersion breaking, no amount of coming in terms with the modern day dialogues will prepare you for the lines in the film that absolutely and without a shadow of a doubt do not belong in a historic fantasy epic. So much so that your lizard brain reflexively triggers a huge red flag every time you hear something like that. There are little lines in the film, some of which you might have already heard from the trailers, like "Let's go, daddy is not coming home," but then there are lines like "Add some stuff in," "Hey, go F yourself, old man," and so much more, which is much worse. And I'm not asking for an archaic, inaccessible old English just for the sake of it, like Robert Eggers films like The Witch. But just look at Lord of the Rings, Kingdom of Heaven, or even Game of Thrones. They have what could approximate to be modern day writing, complete with modern day cursing with the case of Game of Thrones, but the dialogues have actual weight. My point, as I mentioned earlier, a larger than life story like this deserves larger than life dialogues, else we create a certain dissonance that makes the story difficult to immerse yourself into, and that is exactly what has happened. And unfortunately, we spend most of our time with Odysseus, who delivers these uninspired dialogue. Yeah, let's talk about the characters, starting with Odysseus. See, regardless of how weird the characters in Nolan films have been, I mean, let's be real, sometimes they exist more as representations of ideas and the film's themes rather than actual people. One thing they consistently have in common is that they are charismatic. I mean, you have to be in the absence of any other forms of basic human characterization, I guess, and Nolan so far has made sure to cast charismatic actors for the role, be it McConaughey, Washington, DiCaprio, but then you have Odysseus, played by Matt Damon. We have already talked about how Emily Wilson's translation of Odyssey takes liberties with the source material in terms of speech, but one more thing she has done is translate the film's tone and characters through her progressive feminist lens. So the translation and hence the film is less about Odysseus' hubris and pride following the victory at Troy, but more about the guilt and PTSD that comes from it. Odysseus as a result is very different and not what Homer intended to be. He is not your lively heroic leader who loses his mojo as he suffers through the consequences of his hubris. No, he starts off and stays as this demasculinized, whiny, lethargic charisma vacuum of a character, not exactly what you want from the lead of your film. And this is not exactly helped by Matt Damon's performance as Odysseus either. It's not like he's a bad actor either, it's just that he's not the best actor for this particular role. Christian Bale could pull off a character like this while giving off the leading man energy. I mean, look at something like Terminator Salvation or even Nolan's on the Dark Knight trilogy. He can play brooding, damaged characters without sacrificing aura, as the kids say, but Matt Damon's interpretation of Odysseus doesn't come off as such, and we are stuck with a boring lead who is probably the least compelling character in the film. This is also partly due to the fact that compared to his more subtle, nuanced performance, every other side character and the actors who play them, say Himesh Patel, Robert Pattinson, Anne Hathaway, they all deliver strong, believable performance that live up to their character. Not the case with Tom Holland and Zendaya though. Not sure why they keep getting hired. They are just playing themselves again. Two more rather controversial characters I would like to talk about. Well, we'll get to them in the controversy section of the video. Oh yes, there is a controversy section. We'll get into that. In short, weak lead character by design and weak leading performance, not by design, that leave a huge gap in screen presence for most of the film. Contrast this with someone like Agamemnon, played by Ben Safdie, who is probably the best character, at least in an aspirational sense, in the whole film. He barely has any lines and is barely in the film, but he's charismatic beyond measure and is aura farming in every single scene he's in. In fact, the only scene in the film that genuinely had an ounce of testosterone was the one scene where he's revealed at the gates of Troy, ready for the slaughter. So basically, Nolan can create compelling masculine characters, he just chooses not to. Agamemnon's screen presence is also elevated by the fact that he's probably the best presented character in the entire film in every sense of the word. Whether it's his costume, the blocking, the lighting, or the framing, every single time there is a certain care with which the technical aspects of the filmmaking come together to enhance his screen presence. Yeah, with that, let's get into the quality of the production, or lack thereof. See, I'm no expert in Greek armor or costumes or architecture, but I can tell you when something doesn't look right, at least in terms of what should and should not be in an epic historical fantasy. I mean, just look at the armor design for the Trojans. It looks fake and plasticky of all things, and you don't need to be an expert on anything to call it out for looking cheap. The costume design also lacks any sense of character. Everything looks bland and boring, almost trying to blend into the background. As with Nolan, this is again his way of imbuing grounded realism to the production and not a product of incompetence. But the result is still the same. It looks like garbage. You might think that I'm exaggerating things, but I'm not. Things get so bland and generic that there was a scene where Calypso, played by Charlize Theron, was wearing what seemed to be modern day loungewear at the beach, and I was like genuinely questioning Nolan's intent with the costume design. It neither looked epic nor did it look period accurate, and you don't need to be a historian to guess any of that. What you can probably also guess is the fact that the same approach went towards every other aspect of production design. The locations, especially the interior specifically. The palaces lack grandeur in any sense of the word. They look like some marriage hall in a rural village. Granted, this might be historically accurate, but it's definitely not something that I would like looking at in any sort of film. Now, I'm not asking for some ornate diamond encrusted walls and golden chandeliers. No, you can create a sense of awe and luxury without all of that with good production design. I mean, look at the Great Hall in Castle Winterfell from Game of Thrones. It is not opulent or lavish in any sense, but it does command your attention and respect. This is not the case with any of the architecture, especially the interiors in Odyssey, which inspire yawns instead of awe. I would have had more things to say about the production design, but I can't because most of it's barely visible. Once again, in another Nolan masterstroke, all the interiors are lit by practical lights, natural ones from the candles in the room. Now, this in itself wouldn't be a problem if this was done with any semblance of style in mind, but as usual with Nolan, he went for a realistic look, which ends up being dull, flat, and hideous, and lifeless of all things. And it's 2026 now. Barry Lyndon did the same interior practical candlelight thingy around half a century back and achieved much better result. In fact, I'm gonna go ahead and argue that Barry Lyndon looks aesthetically better than Nolan from 50 years in the future, based on any random still from the whole movie. Same with the color grading of the film as well. The muted, desaturated colors do serve the realism, but at what cost? The worst part is, most of the drama as well as the entire finale fight sequence takes place within the interiors of Ithaca, Odysseus' home, and thanks to this dreadful lighting and color grading, it's barely comprehensible. Ah yes, incomprehensible fight sequences, an old Nolan staple. Let's get into that. As I mentioned earlier, the action sequences in Odyssey are glorious to behold, but that compliment only applies to the larger set-piece movements involving fantasy elements. And as soon as it turns into fights between actual human beings, things quickly start going downhill. The first sign of this came with the siege of Troy, which if it were not for Agamemnon, it would have been a total shit show, because as it stands, it looks more like a skirmish than a full-on siege. What should have been portrayed as a battle involving tens and thousands as per the original has been portrayed as a relatively minor engagement involving only a few hundred 100. Obviously, it's unreasonable to have 10,000 extras for a film, and any reasonable filmmaker would have chosen to use CG to supplement the numbers. But hey, this is Nolan we are talking about. You will experience the siege of Troy on his own terms, and you will be happy with it, peasant. But it gets worse. Nolan has never been good with directing hand-to-hand sequences either, and while he preferred to use excessive shaky cam to hide the action during the early days of Batman Begins, the criticism soon got to him, I guess, and he has chosen to abandon that style. But the problem is he replaced it with absolutely nothing, and hence we have the infamous fight sequences from The Dark Knight Rises with the goons randomly flying about or waiting for their turn to get punched. But Nolan's action choreography seems to have improved in the last couple of years, peaking with the Oslo of Report fight sequence in Tenet. So it was heartbreaking to see Nolan having completely reverted to his old ways by the time the finale action sequence in Odyssey rolled in. Now that I think about it, it actually started well before that, with the shaky cam being more and more evident in the set piece movements the moment anyone starts running, but it rears its complete ugly head in the finale fight between Odysseus and the suitors. What was supposed to be a glorious display of Odysseus' skill, technique and mastery of combat became a nauseous exercise in bad fight choreography and even worse cinematography for that matter. As it is the usual case with Nolan films, the lead himself is doing stunts most of the time, with Matt Damon himself performing the actual fights, but he barely connects most of the time and he rarely pulls his bow back to fire an arrow. All the while the camera alternates between focusing on the sloppy fight sequences and quick cutting and shaking about to hide the more embarrassing bits. Mr. Nolan, if you're hearing this, it's okay to hire a second unit, and it's okay to have a stunt performer who knows what they're doing. With all due respect, please take these steps before you embarrass yourself any further. Phew, that was a huge rant. Now let's bring it all together. See, Nolan's Odyssey is a film with uninspired, uneven and unimmersive writing and dialogues delivered primarily by an uncompelling, unappealing leading character brought to life by an uncharismatic actor inhabiting an uninteresting and unremarkable world, where even the most unlethargic moments of the film, namely the action sequences, are brought down by unwatchable fight choreography and cinematography. Each of these elements individually do nothing to bring down the film, but taken together as a whole, it sucks the epic and the fantasy out of the epic fantasy that Odyssey is supposed to be. And the worst part is, it is all by design so that Nolan could put his signature on Odyssey. See, now would be an excellent time to close this video, considering how I have exhausted my primary train of thought about how Nolan's obsession with realism butchers Odyssey, but it would be intellectually and morally dishonest of me to move past without discussing the controversies surrounding the film. So let's get into that. We'll get to the obvious ones in a bit, but something I found out purely via chance while researching the film was the fact that the whole anti-war, anti-masculinity, progressive side of Christopher Nolan's Odyssey is purely based on deliberate and intentional mistranslation of the source material by Emily Wilson. Remember when I asked you to hold on to that thought about Penelope and Telemachus being portrayed in a way that deviates from the source material? Yeah, let's get into that. There is a scene where Odysseus' son Telemachus snaps back at his mother Penelope in a moment of anger when discussing his coronation, and this is presented in Homer's Odyssey as a moment of pleasant surprise as the mother realizes that her boy is becoming a man. But in the Wilson translation and in the Nolan film, her reaction is that of anger and frustration, and of course there would be a few lines that follow about how men are the ones who are only allowed to take the throne, patriarchy, whatever, you know the usual spiel. Then there are the casting choices. Oh boy, the casting choices. Let's get into it. Let me be abundantly clear. Lupita Nyong'o is an amazing actress and she kills it in this film for the limited screen time that she has. Same with Paige. She, whatever. She does a commendable job as well, playing a pivotal role in one of the film's most emotionally charged sequences. Very short screen time again, but commendable job regardless. But why cast these specific actors considering the controversy it would create? You can whine all about this film being fictional all you like, but this is a story set in a very specific geographical location of ancient Greece, and sure as hell, Helen of Troy was not a black woman, and sure as hell, there were no 5 foot 60 kg soldiers in any army at that time. Now the progressive types would like to argue that it's just a fantasy film with monsters and stuff, plus it's only a few minutes of screen time. What's the big deal? And to that I say, if it's not such a big deal, why specifically cast these specific actors in these specific roles? And it's not like a one-off thing either. We are Greeks, announces Himesh Patel while looking exactly like me, the South Indian guy, after offboarding from Odysseus' ship, which also happens to be populated by a Russian man. And Han from Fast and the Furious, is that you? Are there really any Greek actors in Odysseus' ship? No, absolutely not. And what an absolutely disgusting state of affairs that is. Creative freedom, I hear you say, and it's got nothing to do with politics. Okay, but would Hollywood ever cast a Chinese actor in any on-screen adaptation of the stories from Talmud or the Quran? No. Why is that the case? Clearly it's a political move, DI, representation, progressive Hollywood, whatever. But it's quite unfortunate and equally hilarious simultaneously that Christopher Nolan, of all people who values grounded realism above all else, would throw it all away in pursuit of his political ambitions. This was never the case and is highly unexpected from someone like Nolan, and I'm not sure if it's his own choice or someone else is pulling the strings. I genuinely do believe, however, that every filmmaker should be able to express their ideology and beliefs in film as they see fit. So go ahead, Nolan, don't let me stop you. It is really funny, however, that the progressive director Christopher Nolan's Odyssey goes this particular route. Meanwhile, racist director Mel Gibson's Apocalypto features indigenous actors speaking the actual Mayan language, the language of the era where the film was set in. Now, this video has been going on for a bit too long, so let's get this to a close. See, this video was originally meant to be a short review on Odyssey, but it spiraled into something much bigger as I wanted to find out the root cause for why Odyssey, despite all the good it does, didn't quite sit right with me. And as I dug in and broke it all down, ultimately all roads lead to Nolan's misplaced ambition of bringing his trademark grounded realism approach to epic fantasy filmmaking. It has been like 3 days since the release of the film as I write this, and the response to the film has been polarizing to say the least. Of course, you have the single agenda folks who either praise or hate the film thanks to the controversies surrounding it. Then there are the grifters and critics and influencers who are more or less reading off a script at this point. Then there is the non-cinephile crowd who seem to be strangely loving this film. Because like I said, it is a good film, at least on the surface. If you just wanted to watch something to turn your brain off and pass the time, then yeah, it's 100% worth your time. But for someone like me who's a fan of Christopher Nolan's work so far, this is a huge letdown for all the reasons I mentioned above. Unlike something like Tenet, which has a growing following every year as more people realize how masterful it was, I think the opposite is bound to happen for Odyssey as people realize how deeply flawed it is. Closing statement: the real tragedy of Nolan's Odyssey is that it's a film about a man punished for believing he can overcome gods, made by a filmmaker who may have believed he could overcome mythology itself. I think it's high time that Nolan realizes that maybe he should shift his stylistic approach on a film by film basis instead of shoehorning his Nolanisms into everything before he screws up really bad and people start asking if he's actually in fact a one-trick pony or something. Let's hope he realizes that sooner rather than later and stays as one of the greatest directors of the 21st century. So with that, I think I'll close the video. This is the Indian Movie Critic. Bye.